Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Give the People What They Want. Once again, I'm Zoe Alexandra, editor of People's Dispatch, and I'm very happy to once again be joined by Roger McKenzie, who's the international editor at Morning Star News, and Prasanth, who's a journalist in India. We've lots to get to. Thankfully, as we alluded to last week, following the ceasefire with Iran and Israel that has stuck, no new wars as of yet, but we have lots to get into, so let's get to it.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, as has been the case basically since January, a lot of our show is focused on what the Trump administration has done, both domestically in the United States and abroad. A very significant update this week after Trump sort of resolved, in quotes, its conflict with Iran. Now it can really focus on what's important, which is passing this kind of massive bill, which has been called Big Beautiful Bill. This is a bill that has been kind of at the center of a lot of controversy and opposition, both from the Democratic Party, but also from activists in the United States. It's a bill that, following in the steps of his first administration, offering massive tax cuts to the rich, and essentially sacrificing being able to afford this by cutting social programs, cutting, really importantly, Medicaid, intensifying the restrictions on who can access Medicaid. Roger will get to kind of the impacts of that in a bit. Cutting food stamps programs, a lot of different ways of essentially cutting back on these social programs, which there are, very few of in the United States as it is, but are, essential in really supporting low-income and impoverished people in the United States. And so it really poses a big threat. And on the other hand, of course, while taking away these social programs, giving more money to, for example, sustaining and maintaining this, defense of defense, in quotes, of course, defense of the border, deploying more agents so that these deportations can advance, which is another kind of cornerstone of the Trump presidency policy and kind of goal, which is, again, to meet this deportation quota of 10 million people. So it's really kind of like a economic reconfiguration that he's imposing in order to achieve his kind of policy goals, which is again, deporting a bunch of people, to 10 million people, and also, offering these privileges to the rich, who of course have surrounded Trump in the recent years. We've obviously seen how the kind of tech bro CEOs have flocked to Trump. Of course, they're benefiting from these policies, and the working people, and a lot of the working people that voted for him, are going to be negatively impacted by this. So the Big Beautiful Bill was passed in one chamber of the House, in the House of Representatives. Now it's going to go back to the Senate with some of the changes, with some of these negotiations that have taken place. And again, it's really been at the middle of a lot of controversy, with a lot of Democrats, most of the Democrats opposing it, some of them kind of engaging with a little bit. And so we'll see what happens in the Senate. We know that, it's not favorable for the Democrats who are in large opposing it. So it could be a point of controversy. We also know that Elon Musk has had a lot to say about the Big Beautiful Bill. It doesn't cut enough. It should be cutting more. Again, it's going to be a really important moment what happens in again, the Senate, just because if this passes, it will, again, fundamentally change how the U.S. government works, where the money goes to, and again, the impacts on the people will be profound. So, Roger, I know you had followed a couple of the reports talking about the impacts of this. How are the people going to be? How are they going to feel if this bill passes?
I think that's really important that we see these cuts not as some kind of academic kind of discussion, and it's some kind of economics trip. These cuts will affect real people. Now, one of the impacts of these kind of swathe of cuts in the US has been around the international aid bill, and again, completely understand and realize and really do understand how over the years much of this foreign aid has been used to support the US foreign policy agenda. But what we saw this week was a report from The Lancet, very renowned, very respected medical journal, perhaps the most respected medical journal in the world. And they said the results of the kind of 80% plus cuts in the US foreign aid budget will lead to something like 14 million extra deaths internationally between now and 2030. Now that's massive. That is huge. And when you put on top of that the wars that much of this extra spending or the cuts are going to support the military, well, you can put on top of that the amount of deaths that will be caused by these wars across the globe, then we're talking well in excess of 14 million people being affected directly as a consequence of the decisions that have been taken to make these cuts. Now, all of this is taking place at the same time as there's a huge conference taking place in Seville in Spain. The conference, organized by the UN and Spain, is really about trying to look at the poverty gap that exists between the richest and the smallest nations. Again, completely understand how many of these UN conferences can get quite performative, really. But this conference is an important opportunity for not just those member states of the UN to come along and to take an active part and to reach decisions that's going to reduce the wealth gap, but also for activists to make their voice heard at these conferences. Now, one of the problems is, of course, is that the US, the biggest donor to the UN, the biggest donor to this whole process, has made it really clear that they have no intention at all and have not attended the conference. Makes it very clear where they stand in terms of poverty reduction, but they have also made it clear that the process that's been taking place to reach an agreement between all these member nations who've been attending the conference, that they have no intention of following it as well. So we've got the biggest donor to the UN saying, doesn't matter what you do, we are going out on our own, we will do as we please, we don't take part in this kind of multilateral process. So we have a situation where millions of people are likely to die because of as a direct result of these cuts. We have a process that's been taking place through the UN that is being completely dissed by the US. And we have activists around the globe campaigning to try and bring down this gap between the rich and the poor. Of course, one way that nations could and are increasingly trying to reduce this poverty gap is to look to places like China and to look at the successes that China has been able to achieve in terms of being able to reduce poverty, massive poverty reduction that we've seen in China. So we have to keep the pressure on again to make sure that the US lives up to its responsibilities. But given that they've made it perfectly clear that they're not interested in working with other nations to bring down, to deal with poverty, then that is something that we are going to have to, as the certain global majority, have to look for where those successes in reducing poverty are taking place. We can't just wait for the United States to do the right thing. So China is going to play an increasingly important role, I think, going forward, because they have had that massive success. So I think this is a story that doesn't get reported too much elsewhere, but I think it's something that we can keep an eye on and continue to report from Give the People What They Want.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Roger, speaking of China's role, just last month or 2 months back, perhaps by now, an important conference was held in China with members of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, where numerous agreements were reached to actually not only just do aid, but actually create programs so that there can be share of knowledge and increased kind of commercial opportunities. But I think that, you know, what this shows is that the U.S. and the global North states are really not invested in these income gaps and ending inequality because they have their priorities elsewhere. And a lot of that is in war, in the weapons industry. Prasanth, a really important report was just released by Francesca Albanese. Tell us about that report.
Right, yeah, actually perfectly, it works perfectly with what we've been talking before, because the report placed before the UN Human Rights Council, I think it will be discussed on Thursday, is titled From the Economy of Occupation to the Economy of Genocide. And it's a very short report, about 39 pages. Basically what it does is, I think it, in a very, very efficient and very comprehensive way, really defines what you would call the nuts and bolts of the genocide that is taking place right now against the people of Gaza. In the sense that, we see these reports every day of dozens of people, sometimes hundreds of people being killed, often at 8 points, and the question really is basically that how is this happening? Of course, the agent on the ground, so to speak, is the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli fighter planes, Israeli soldiers, etc., etc. But behind that is this entire infrastructure of genocide, which especially involves some of the biggest companies in the world, some of the most prominent companies in the world, famous and infamous for a variety of reasons. And it is that relationship that Francesca Albanese captures in this report, and which is why the title is very important, because I think it's one very important aspect of this report is basically the fact that she covers, there's a trajectory that she captures here, and there are various entry points into this trajectory. There's one, the history of Palestine itself, the history of occupation itself, stretching to 75 years and beyond, before the Nakba itself. Then there is the question of the IG Farben trials, for instance, which happened after the Nazi spell, which revealed the extent of the role of big corporations in these kind of genocidal activities. There are examples from South Africa, and she brings all of that together to actually show how some of the biggest companies in the world are involved. Starting from some of the big tech companies like Amazon and Google. They have a project called Project Nimbus. It's been reported before, which works very closely with the Israeli government. Companies like Microsoft, all of which have played a key role in sustaining Israeli domestic infrastructure and military infrastructure, for that matter. We have companies like, say, Caterpillar or and other companies which make civilian equipment, so to speak, but which are the equipment of these companies being used on a vast scale to demolish Gaza, to demolish the West Bank. We have companies, arms companies, of course, very typical, classic examples, Lockheed Martin. We have Leonardo, many other, Elbit Systems, obviously an Israeli company, which have manufactured these weapons. There are so many sectors, talking, for instance, about companies like BlackRock, which have invested in so many of the companies we talked about, right? And because of which, I say even pension funds get implicated in this, because they are pension funds invested in BlackRock, and then BlackRock invests in entities which have a direct role in this genocide. And so there's this entire web of financial institutions, of corporate institutions, which are all playing a very active role in the genocide of the people of Gaza today. And it is this web that this report chronicles. And it's very essential, I think, to also read this report, because sometimes people ask the question of, okay, there's so much, we're far away, we don't know what to do about this. It is, it's horrifying. What exactly do we do? And of course, one option is, of course, which millions of people across the world are exercising, is coming onto the streets, pressuring your governments, etc., etc. But the other option, of course, is also that you apply pressure at these nodal points, which are enabling the genocide of the people of Gaza, whether it be the tech companies, whether it be the civilian companies, and that becomes an important aspect of pressure as well, which is really what the BDS movement has been doing for a long time. And in some senses, this perfectly complements the agenda of that larger movement, because it really demonstrates what is involved or in this genocide. So I think it's a very important report. It will go before the UN Human Rights Council, unfortunately, which does not have any, whose resolutions don't have any binding power. Israel and US have left disengaged with the council, so it's not they're going to listen to it anyway, and it's not that they listen to UN resolutions anyway. But I think for the rest of the world, for people with a conscience, it's important to actually see the extent to which some of the companies we are involved with, or which play a key role in our lives on a day-to-day basis, are are equally a part of this genocide as well. Also important to note a company like Palantir, a lot of discussion in recent times about a very important because of the role it's playing across the world in the United States. It began as a military intelligence company, so to speak, in some senses, but increasingly it is playing a role in civilian infrastructure as well, in creating databases for the government to use across a variety of programs. One of the largest rising stocks, if I'm not mistaken, and very close association with the Trump administration, of course, but clearly a company which is going to have a huge role in creating this, very horrible future because of its technology. So I would urge everyone to read that report to really get a sense of what is also, behind the bullets, behind the surveillance, behind the murders, whose hands are involved. That's very important to chronicle.
Yeah, and it's interesting to point out that Francesca Albanese is one of the most censored people in Europe. When she was on tour, many of her events were canceled due to pressure or just a direct decision by the perhaps the building that was hosted, the university. Important to note that someone who is bringing to light such evident truths about the companies that are behind the genocide, of course, is censored. So she continues to be an important voice in shedding light not only on what's happening in the atrocious situation, but who is actually responsible for it and complicit in it. So, Roger, to flip a little bit, to go to a different continent again, important reports on the state of Ghanaian workers in Nigeria. Can you talk about what you've found out about this?
Well, in a sense, it really does link well with what we've talked about, because when you're in a state of poverty, or when you live in a war-torn country, and you're always looking for a way out, and just on top of that, as kids, you've all got dreams about what you want to be. You want to be a famous footballer or something. You want to find an opportunity for a way out. So when somebody comes into your community and offers you the golden ticket and says that here is an opportunity for you to go and sign for one of the great football teams of Europe, and we will provide the transport to get you there, and here is the opportunity of a lifetime. Most people who are in those sorts of situations, with their dreams, with everything that's happening around them, are going to take that opportunity. And that's what many Ghanaian kids are doing at the moment. So loads of young men in particular have been promised these opportunities and are being transported into Nigeria, and then having their passports confiscated, then having their mobile phones taken off them, their mobile phones used to ring their families to try and relatives to try and extort more money from their relatives as well. So this is a massive scam that's taking place. But this week we saw dozens and dozens of Ghanaians rescued from that situation in Nigeria, and many of their stories are starting to come out. It would be really, really easy just to think that this was something that was just a thing between Nigeria and Ghana, and that there wasn't some real big deal person sitting behind all this, making all the money. And that's what is starting to emerge now, that there's some real sharks, really, who appear to be either from the United States or from other parts of Europe, or from Europe, who are raking in the money from this scam. So there's no doubt, the Ghanaians and the Nigerians are really clear that they haven't got fully to the bottom of all this yet, but the information about what is actually happening is really important. We talked last week about modern day slavery. Well, this really links into that as well. And this is something that I think as activists that we must all look out for and all watch. I think it's easily something that can go under the radar and stay underreported. So something that journalists need to keep an eye on as well, because with everything else happening in the world, it's really easy just to think, well, we just need to report the wars and so on, when actually there's some real, scams, there's some real hardships that are being inflicted on people of the global majority by, it seems like, people from the West, people from the global minority, and we need to be reporting and exposing those people for what they're doing to people. So, let's keep an eye on this too. It's all part of the exploitation of people of the global majority, and it really must stop, but it will only stop if we shine a spotlight on it.
Yeah, I think it's a very important story to bring to the fore, Roger, especially given that it is really a function of capitalism in itself. Find the most oppressed and exploited class of people and use them to kind of supplant and create this artificial sense that you can drive down wages, that you can just exploit people for the cheapest way possible. So it is really a function of the capitalist system and how it functions. And that's why it's so prevalent across the world, not only in the Gulf, but of course, even within Africa. And, there are people who are profiting off of this because, of course, it is to drive up profit. So, complicated. And this is something, of course, that is happening, that there's this in Latin America as well, even within the region, a continent with one of the highest levels of inequality, with few outliers that are not kind of subjected and forced into this artificial and really gross inequality that we see in many countries of the regions. One of these countries is Cuba. Cuba is a country that, of course, since its revolution in 1959, has sought to reverse this inequality, to educate the masses, to bring literacy to people who were not allowed to learn how to read. And because of these programs, because of its revolution, because of all of these different programs that it's been able to implement through its revolutionary government, it is one of the countries that does not suffer from the same scourge of inequality like we see across Latin America. And because of this, because of its example, because of its policies, because of its policy of solidarity, it, of course, as we've talked about many times, it's always been under the boot of the United States, with, of course, active invasions in the beginning, and then constant sabotage, constant schemes to try to undermine the revolution. And of course, the blockade has always been there, but this has been intensified in recent years, and especially during the first presidency of Donald Trump. Not only imposing more sanctions, 243 sanctions, including, for example, the Helms-Burton third title, which essentially means that anyone who has business dealings in Cuba that might be on lands of lands that were expropriated could be subject to a fine and it's not a criminal prosecution, but prosecution in U.S. courts. All of these sanctions and all of these measures have essentially, intensified the boot that's been on Cuba's neck. And Joe Biden, as we've reported on People's Dispatch, and I know on Morningstar as well, Joe Biden did nothing to reverse any of these policies, did nothing to, return to the era of 2015 when President Barack Obama actually opened relations with Cuba, the cooling period. There was even talk of lifting the blockade. That is almost hard to remember that this was something that happened in U.S. and Cuban relations. And recently, earlier this week, Trump went a step further, and Joe Biden had lifted a couple of the sanctions, allowing for remittances to be sent. His very last day, removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. We know on the first day of Trump's presidency, that was one of the first things he did, put Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Of course, it's not even necessary on this show to really explain and go into the details of exactly why that is so ridiculous. But and this week he increased the measures on Cuba and is really hoping to drive this regime change that has been a tenet of US policy since the revolution, crush the economy, crush the possibility for the Cuban people to live in peace and to have access to healthcare, to have access to education, make it so impossible that the people revolt. So far, as we've seen in the past decade, the Cuban people have held strong. They're very committed to the revolution. They know that these measures are because the US cannot accept the revolution and cannot accept the role that Cuba plays in the region. But it is a very concerning moment where the Cuban people have already been suffering the pandemic, the hurricanes, the increased measures, and right now they're at kind of a critical point. Of course, the electrical grid, the fires that took place. And so Trump is really trying to take advantage of this moment, drive the boot in harder, and of course, hope that he achieves what no US president has been able to achieve, which is the end of the Cuban Revolution. So, of course, we're going to keep following it. We know that Cuba plays such an important role, not only in Latin America, but in the entire world. The medical brigades, the different roles of solidarity. So, of course, the people of the world see this with a lot of shock and a lot of concern. And of course, we've seen many people already mobilizing. So important to follow people of the world on the streets, as we know, for many reasons against the genocide. But one place where protests have been very strong against the government for its different policies has been Kenya. The people were back on the streets in the past week. Prasanth.
Yeah, right. So actually, just a couple of weeks ago, we did talk about Kenya, and that was in the context of a death of a blogger, Albert Ojwang, who died in police, was killed in police custody. Massive protests took place in Kenya, and on the 25th, last week, we saw another huge mobilization, hundreds of thousands of people, and they were commemorating what took place last year, which was these huge protests against the finance bill of 2024. And though that period saw the death or the disappearance of at least 61 people, if not more, and there's still no justice to this day for many of those deaths. And last week, what we saw was the people coming back to the streets to commemorate that. But what happened once again was repression from the police. And of course, we saw this repression taking place in the capital, but also in major cities across the country. I believe more than half the counties in the country saw protests and massive repression by the police as well. And 16 people were killed. And again, this is probably, we don't know if there could be more such cases of this sort, hundreds injured again. And the visuals clearly demonstrate the kind of repression that took place. But again, I think this, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, this really brings to the fore the question, the point that President William Ruto's government has really lost a lot of credibility, especially among the youth, as he came to power promising with this platform of promising to change, bring about social change to Kenya, especially in terms of employment, especially for the youth. And we see that after all these years, all he has to offer are the same old policies of the IMF, which is austerity, debt servicing, spending all the government's money on servicing debt, and as far as the people are concerned, more taxes, right? No real solution to the unemployment problem. And there's massive inequality in Kenya, like in so many other countries. And on top of all this, you see the incredible repression that takes place each and every time people in Kenya protest, which has led to cycles of protests. We saw protests in 23, we saw protests in 24, we saw protests 2 weeks ago, we're seeing protests. And I think this brings, this really demonstrates the systemic nature of the crisis in Kenya, which is really that Kenya is right now running on an economic model of extreme neoliberalism and a political model of completely bowing to diktats of the United States and pretty much serving as an agent of the US in that region, and which really leaves the people very, very unhappy, very, very discontented with what is going on, which is what is leading to these kind of protests. And I think we'll probably see more of these protests in the coming time as well. One alarming thing we did see was that there was an attempt to actually black out the media during this time. There was an order that went out calling for that the protest should not be shown on TV at all. Later, of course, it was that order was challenged and finally removed. But we saw a very clear attempt at censoring some of these protests as well. But the fact is that the repression by the police is clearly not going to save the government at this point of time. It is not going to stop the anger of the Kenyan masses, which is really about very, very fundamental issues, which is really, about corruption, which is about debt, which is about unemployment, which is about the fact that they don't, so many Kenyan youth don't feel like they have the space to voice their frustration. Last year, important to note, the protests actually went to parliament, which is clearly a message to the government that, you are not hearing what we are feeling. You're not hearing what we're saying. You were a president who promised to listen to our concerns, but where are you now? And that, I think, is the spirit on the streets of Kenya today. Really, really a lot of anger. So it's one country we really need to watch out for. Very important country in the region. Economically still in the region, economically quite the powerhouse. But I think the signs are not good for William Ruto. This is what he continues. This is the path he continues to take.
Definitely very concerning developments in terms of the repression. Just, anecdotally, we know that reporters had their cameras seized, really an intent to just completely black out, not allow any information, images get shared. But of course, that hasn't stopped the Kenyan people. And of course, we'll be following this even more on People's Dispatch, on Give the People What They Want, about the really brave resistance of the Kenyan people, that despite seeing how many people have been killed by the police, not only on the streets, but also, of course, the blogger who was killed in police custody, people continue to say we're demanding change and we're demanding something better. So very important story to follow. And that brings us to the end of our show today. Of course, once again, a whirlwind across the world. We bring these stories because they're important to be heard, to be understood. Stories that not always are told, angles that are not always explored. So, of course, continue following us at Morningstar, at People's Dispatch, on all our different platforms. Come back next week and listen to the show. We really want to be bringing these stories to you. Again, bringing these spots that the mainstream media oftentimes refuses to share. So thanks, everyone. Once again, we'll be back with you next week with more stories and hopefully better news.